A Shalom Akim, Shalom, Shalom, giving all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh, Ba'ashem, Havashai, Ba'ashem, Rakakwadash. Double honors to the apostles and the elders of Great Millstone for teaching us his truth, and salutations to the sincere Akim and Akwathim. Listen, may the blessing of election be upon your house. My name is Raquai. I'm back in here with another quick and Lord's will is always edifying lesson. And for today's lesson, doing some reflection and listening to some of the other brothers and elders, and the title of that was came to my mind was that our people don't care about their own history, and knowing your history is so important, because when you know your own history, you know and understand the your own heritage and where you come from, and also it gives you a template and an outline of how you conduct yourself, because within your own history you have different nuggets of information, of the different forefathers, of different even foremothers as well, for women who listen, right? Within the history you receive different nuggets of information in regards to how many of our people, of our own foreparents, conducted themselves in situations. And because the scriptures talk about how that which is then is now, so a lot of the things that they went through, we would go through, right? And because there's really nothing new under the sun, right? So I kind of wanted to just what's the word I'm looking for, go through this topic, and just understanding that when you first come across this understanding, like you have a very strong zeal, a strong fire, you want to tell everybody, but then you mature and you realize, and you might make some mistakes, I've done it, I've made some mistakes as well, and you realize that a lot of our people really truly don't care about their own history. They honestly don't care. It's not something that is of concern to them. It's not something that is a priority. It's not something um they have a desire for. you know their desire is whether it might be to either make money, build a nice house. Their desires are pretty much like when you read that parable of the rich fool, basically. And the rich fool, how essentially how he was more focused on, like, what, building a bigger storehouse, so to speak, right? That was his, essentially his mind frame, right? And tomorrow, man, I want to build some bigger ones. And because, and one of the things, and he kept building it to the point where he essentially he neglected his relationship with Yahweh Bashim El Shai. He neglected building that type of relationship, right? So I just wanted to I guess I didn't really have anything written down, but it was something I was meditating on. And this is something that our people don't actually consider. They don't actually see essentially the value in knowing their own history, right? Knowing when you were in sovereign power, knowing when you were when you were in rulership, knowing when you made certain mistakes, knowing when you exemplified certain examples of righteousness, knowing when certain aspects of your faith was tested, and the Lord delivered a lot of different mothers and forefathers out of different situations, right? That's part of us, all part of the history, right? So I guess I'll start off with Proverbs 1, right? And kind of just flow, right? And this is Proverbs chapter 1, verse 20. And it says, "Wisdom crieth without, she uttereth her voice in the streets. She crieth in the chief place of concourse, in the openings of the gates in the city. She uttereth her words, saying, How long, ye simple ones, will ye love simplicity? And the scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Turn you at my reproof. Behold, I will pour out my spirit unto you, and make my words known. Make known my words unto you. I'm sorry, right? So, you know, I'm reading this to show the example of actually what's playing out, through the Lord, pretty much sending His prophets, and you can call it a sentiment of compassion, right? Apostle Paul said, I may be rude in speech, but not in knowledge, right? So disregarding of how the message actually comes out, what we're actually, giving our people really is a sense of, you can say, charity, right? Because Yahushua said, man should not live by bread alone, by every word that proceeded out of the Most High, right? And I think that's also in the Torah, right? So, that bread, that understanding, coupled with our history is all mixed in there, right? And it's all part to essentially satisfy, that spiritual hunger that our people are strongly lacking, right? There's a precept somewhere, I think in the Apocrypha, where it says how the manna essentially was, what's it called? It was basically kind of like designed to the taste of every person, right? So, it's, and part of that is also knowing is part of our history, right? And our people, and okay, so when it refers to the simplicity, because our people are in a very simple state of mind, because they make a lot of the same mistakes, because they don't have any understanding of their history. Like, for example, you might speak to some people and you might hear them say, hear certain things, and it's like, oh, this person made the same mistake, this person did in the scriptures, right? But, if only they knew that, but because they don't care to know that, they realize they essentially they're just repeating their offenses, right, without actually trying or knowing to break the cycle, knowing, and then repenting, and then trying to break the cycle, right? But it shows you that our people would rather stay simple. They would rather they just don't care. They really and truly just don't care. They don't care about the Lord's compassion, through His apostles, elders, prophets, and they don't care about knowing their identity. They don't see any power in that. For them, it's more about seeing the value in the physical things, and rather than the spiritual things. And the scriptures talk about how wisdom is the principal thing, and therefore get wisdom, and with all that get understanding. Right? Wisdom really and truly is the principle. As a matter of fact, hold on. Let me, I'm just going to jump across to chapter 3. Then I'll come back to chapter 1. Okay, this is Proverbs chapter 3, verse 13. And it says, Happy is the man that findeth wisdom, and the man that getteth understanding. For the merchandise of it is better than the merchandise of silver, and the gain thereof than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies. And all the things that thou canst desire are not to be compared to her. Right? So it says, the length of days is in her hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. Right? So if you look and go through, the moments and periods of our history with different forefathers, they exemplified having what's it called, having wisdom in certain situations, right? And in doing so, you realize they were essentially elevated. Well, that's another example I like to use is Joseph when we were in Egypt, right? So, even though Joseph had received, um, he had gone through his moments of suffering. One of the things that when you go through a lot of these different accounts of different forefathers, right? They were probably in a low position, and then eventually the Lord lifted them up, right? Because what does the scripture say about somebody who has wisdom? It says it maketh their face to shine, right? It makes them glow. It has gives them a certain glow about them, right? So essentially Joseph was put in a position, in a situation where he was glorified, for actually having for having wisdom, right? He was, out of all the people there, he was actually to be able to give understanding in regards to the Pharaoh's dream, right? So essentially he was lifted up, and then he gave credit to Yahweh Shem Shai, right? So it shows you, you know the importance of being nigh unto the Lord, not leaning upon our own understanding. And it shows you that the spiritual riches are trump the physical, right? So, and then walking in a particular way, the Lord can reward you, with that physical. But our people are too more caught up in the physical, right, and lack the spiritual, because they don't know how to handle the physical, because they don't have the spiritual, right? So, and so let me go back to Proverbs 1 and verse 24, and it says, because I have called, and ye refuse, I have stretched out my hand, and no man regarded. But ye have set at naught all my counsel, and would none of my reproof. I also will laugh at your calamity, I will mock when your fear cometh. When your fear cometh as desolation, and your destruction cometh as a whirlwind, and when distress and anguish cometh upon you, and then shall they call upon me, but I will not answer, and they will seek me early and shall not find me, right? So, our people, essentially, because they've disregarded very important things, of what the Lord's prophets were saying, they're going to be disregarded, right? And like, for example, like there's a precept in Hosea where it says, in their affliction they shall seek me early, right? Because when they don't have any spiritual substance, you know and even physical substance too, because the physical substance, basically, when they have so much of that, it basically it makes them comfortable. It kind of, it enlarges their waistband, so there's no really need to actually think about the Lord, right? They're not in an uncomfortable position where they try to, they know that they have to rely upon the Lord, if that makes sense, right? If you really were always comfortable, then and everything was well furnished for you, everything was always taken care of, so on and so forth. Why would you have a reason to think about the Lord? That's why it says in Proverbs, give me poverty nor riches, right? you know because you're kind of always in a position where, okay, that you understand that you need the Lord, right? You don't want to take the Lord's name and do something to transgress, but at the same time, you don't want to be so full to the point where you forget the Lord, right? So, and even Apostle Paul, he even touches upon this when he says, I know when to be abased and I know when to be abound, right? So knowing when I'm going up and then knowing when I'm down, right? But those are all part of spiritual riches. That's spiritual exercise, right? So in regards to essentially the history, I wanted to get this here. This is Romans chapter 15, verse 4. And it says, "For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the scriptures, might have hope," right? So the different accounts, the different, stories, those are able to actually guide us in regards to situational awareness of what certain forefathers and foremothers did, in their situations, right? So we know how to actually be, to maintain and keep stable, right? And Job said, inquire and search in the ways of our fathers, because their templates in regards to trying to figure out, and it's not even, they don't even apply the templates they have right now. Our people don't care to actually know about these stories and extract the spiritual aspect of what occurs in these different scenarios. They don't see the value in that. For them, it's more about seeing the value in, this current, this current society, basically. Seeing the value in, having, whether it might be a name for themselves, seeing the value in their nice house. Like, if the Lord blesses you with these things, it is what it is. But like, the point is, they don't see the value in the spiritual things, right? There's something that Paul said. You know, he said, a carnal man cannot receive the things. Let me read it, actually. Hold on. I think is that 1 Corinthians 2? Oh, the natural man. I'm sorry. This is 1 Corinthians 2, verse 13, and it says, and then the point's really in 14. Excuse me. And it says, "Which things we speak, not in the words of man's wisdom teacheth, but which the Holy Spirit teacheth, comparing spiritual things with spiritual." So we're extracting the value in the spiritual things of these different situations and accounts of our forefathers is really what's, very valuable. Whether it might have been different fruits of the Spirit this person exemplified or this person was lacking. Like, for example, normally I like to use the examples of, like, between Saul and David. How Saul was very, very carnal at certain points of his walk, and then David was very spiritual in moments of his walk, right? He exemplified humility in this particular situation, because sometimes he would be performing miracles, but then he would ask people not to tell anybody, right? So certain things, you can extract, from these different situations, and you can apply it to yourself and your walk and in your situations, right? This is understanding the value within the history, right? What happened in the history, knowing, particular timelines, knowing what, different, people did in those situations, right? So all this information is valuable, right? But our people don't see it that way, because scriptures talk about how really, wisdom is too high for a fool. Let me see if I can find that. Okay, this is sorry. This is Proverbs chapter 24, verse 7, and it says, "Wisdom is too high for a fool. He openeth not his mouth in the gate," right? So, when you speak certain things, our people, it doesn't make them dance. It doesn't make them, excited. It kind of just goes into one ear and comes out the other, basically. Our people really and truly don't care. They really and truly don't care, right? So, when calamity falls upon them, this is, it's just, they, they care about what they care about, basically, right? and their end result is going to be pretty much like the man in that parable with the rich fool, right? Because they didn't have that rich relationship to understand and care about the Lord's compassion through his prophets, is actually show you in the history about who our people are and the prophecies, and then understanding that value in the spiritual riches, because that's part of spiritual riches too, to compare those things and equate it, and to pull out different you know um nuggets of what this person did or what they didn't do and what they could have done differently, right? All that is comparing spiritual things with spiritual to be able to help yourself and nurture your self-development, right? So let me go back. Where was I? This is verse 14. It's First Corinthians 2, and it says, "But the natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of the Most High, for they are foolishness unto him, neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned," right? So our people don't see the benefit of you know essentially going into the history, and the natural. When you're natural, you can't, when you take things strictly on face value, you cannot extract the spiritual things of what's actually taking place around you, right? So verse 15, and it says, "But he that is spiritual judgeth all things, but he himself is judged of no man," because most of the people you might encounter are carnal, right? And our people are really supposed to be the spiritual people. That's the whole joke, right? But our people, because they've been surrounded by heathens so long, they've been sauteed in Babylon for so long, they don't, it doesn't have, they don't, there's no value in being spiritual. It's just strictly just to be carnal, right? Just like your enemy, right? So I didn't really have anything written down, but I honestly, and some brothers can probably even attest to this, when you come across a lot of our people, they realize that they really and truly don't care. They just don't care about their own history. For them to know that they're an Israelite is not something of value to them, right? So, anyways, I'll leave the lesson there, but Lord's will, this lesson was edifying. So to give all praises, glory, and honor to Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. Until next time, I say Shalom.